So today we've got Jörg Schumacher from TU Ilmenau in Germany. So he did his PhD in Potsdam and has been at various institutions, but started in TU Ilmenau in 2005, where he's now a professor. And he'll be talking about large-scale order in turbulent convection, from supercomputer simulations to machine learning models.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and I'm happy to present our research in Leeds, even though I would have loved to be there in person and talk to you guys. But anyhow, let's make the best out of it. So I'm going to talk about the large-scale order in turbulent convection, and the talk, the talk is divided in two big parts. In the first part, we are really concerned with the structure formation processes, and this is a joint work with my PhD students and postdocs, former postdocs, and with Katapali Srinivasan, Janet Shiel, and Rodion Stepanov. And in the second part, we are switching gears a little bit, and I'm going to talk about our machine learning applications for turbulent convection. In particular, we have focused to so-called reservoir computing models, and I will say a few words about these models and of what we have done with these models. That's again work with my former postdocs and current PhD students, Erik Fonda, who's now in London working in a company, and Katapali Srinivasan. So let me start with an introductory example. As you can see, this is the sun observed from a satellite, and we observe an extremely complex surface behavior. We have these magnetic loops, we have these intense magnetic regions, and you see in between a kind of granular type surface, and that is an expression of the turbulent convection, which takes place in the outer 30% of the solar interior. And indeed, as you can see by this kind of sketch, it's an extremely complex physical process. It involves rotation, it involves radiative transfer, it involves changes in the chemical composition of the plasma, and last but not least, certainly also the whole magnetic interaction, the interaction with the magnetic field, including the dynamo action. So it's an extremely complex convection phenomenon, and at the surface and close to the surface, one can actually observe a well-ordered hierarchy of structures in the solar example. The smallest building block are granules, which have about a diameter of 1,000 kilometers, live for about 10 minutes, and the typical velocity comes close to the speed of sound. That's about 3 kilometers per second, and they are observed, they can be observed optically. The next structure in this hierarchy are the so-called supergranules, 30 times larger, roughly. They live for a day and are characterized by a somewhat smaller characteristic velocity, and they are typically observed by helioseismology or granule tracking. And the figure which you see in the middle is a so-called surface divergence picture that characterizes the upwelling and downwelling regions. And then, and I put on purpose a question mark because it's currently highly debated. Some researchers think that there's even a third building block, that is, these are the so-called giant cells, which basically stretch out over the whole convection zone. They are very long living structures for about a month, and the velocity that can be assigned with them is extremely small. And that's exactly the problem with the reliable detection of these structures. I also want to remind you that Rayleigh numbers and Prandtl numbers, these are dimensionless parameters which characterize the thermal driving in the convection flow and which quantify material properties, are very large with 10 to 22. And the Prandtl number in particular, which is typical for stellar interiors, is extremely small with 10 to -6 roughly. So even though these granules and supergranules are observed in many experiments, so there is enough clear experimental evidence for them, as you can see, for instance, in this bottom movie, where exactly such supergranules are rebuilt. And you see in the figure also these active magnetic regions which appear here. There is still a problem in the numerical models, which still, for which it is still a challenge to couple the surface layer to the bulk of the convection zone. And also the role of the slow rotation is not fully understood and is a topic of active current investigation in that field. And the figure I'm just showing you here is a state-of-the-art supercomputer simulation by a Japanese group, and they have basically changed the top boundary conditions, and not much happened with the structure formation processes further down in the convection layer. So the numerical simulations still cannot consistently reproduce granulation and supergranulation. And so the question or the motivation of our research studies is, why don't we try to go back to a much more simpler convection flow and see how far we get in such a system in terms of the formation of structures and in terms of the formation of hierarchy of structures. And that is exactly what I'm going to discuss in the following. Here once more, on the left-hand side, the solar convection case and a picture from state-of-the-art global simulations of solar convection. And to the right, the very strongly idealized system, namely that of Rayleigh-Bénard convection. And just to make clear how strongly we simplify the physics, I have just put this table at the bottom of the slide, and you see what is all simplified. So we go incompressible instead of unelastic. There is no radiative transfer. For the moment, there are no magnetic fields involved. I will include rotation a little bit later in the talk. We typically assume that the plasma is fully ionized, and the only thing which we are taking from the real case is that flux-driven boundary conditions are probably the ones which come closest to the situation in the convection zone. But also the material parameters, as you can see, are chosen constant in our model. So it's an extremely strong simplification. Nevertheless, let's see if we can learn and understand something in this context from this model here. So I just put down the equations which we are solving in our direct numerical simulations. These simulations are apply a so-called spectral element method, and they are thus exponentially fast converging as all spectral schemes. There's the mass balance, which is the incompressibility condition. There's the momentum balance, that is the Navier-Stokes equation, which contains the buoyancy term. as the last term on the right-hand side that couples the temperature to the velocity field. And the energy balance is basically reduced to an advection diffusion equation for the temperature field. We consider extremely far extended layers. The aspect ratio in both horizontal directions is 60 in relation to the height of the layer. For the studies which I'm reporting here, the Prandtl number is chosen to 1. And in correspondence with the thermal boundary conditions, we have two kinds of Rayleigh numbers. In the Dirichlet case, for which we prescribe the temperature at the top and at the bottom, it's the Rayleigh number RAD, and the Neumann type Rayleigh number, for which we prescribe the temperature derivative, the normal derivative of the temperature field, it's the RAN. We also have varied the boundary conditions of the velocity field at the top and at the bottom to free slip or no slip boundaries. At the sides, we are applying periodic boundary conditions for all fields. So let's take a look at the temperature field. I'm showing you here a snapshot of these simulations. And we always have 4 different cases at each Rayleigh number. It's the Neumann condition and the free slip, that's NFS. NNS would mean Neumann and no slip. DFS, Dirichlet, free slip, and DNS, Dirichlet, and no slip boundary condition. There are 3 Rayleigh numbers, 10 to 5, 10 to 6, and 10 to 7. And the temperature contour, which is shown here, is close to the top surface. So we view from the top onto the convection layer. And let's first take a look at the 2 right columns here. And we see that there's this typical roll pattern, which you would expect in an extended convection layer. And when you're going higher in the Rayleigh number, this pattern still remains. And so there remain these kind of structures that are reminiscent to the onset of convection, which sometimes are also denoted as turbulent superstructures. To the left, you see that the picture changes completely. We basically get one big hot blob, and we get one big cold blob, which is split up here due to the periodic boundary conditions in the horizontal directions. But there's one big structure that survives, and this structure is overlaid with a granule pattern, as you can also see. So the temperature boundary conditions seem to matter. And what we observe then is a kind of a very big granular system, which we term motivated by the solar context supergranule. So let me show you a movie. The simulations typically start with the equilibrium conditions. So the fluid is at rest and the temperature profile is perturbed slightly. And then you see how the system goes through an ongoing aggregation process. So from the typical roll patterns, the structures are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And please take a look at the time scales here. These are measured in convective time units, and that is the free fall time in our system. So it's a very slow, it's a very gradual process. And the process basically stops when one big structure survives in that layer, and that big structure cannot grow anymore. So you have to believe me that this is going on until there is one big cell in the middle. I hope you do so. And okay, so now we might ask, okay, can we understand this structure formation process? And let's take a look back into the literature. And indeed, there have been already studies in that context. that go back to Hurl and co-workers in the late 60s of the last century, where they basically conducted linear stability analysis for the Bénard problem with boundaries at finite conductivity. And one of the limiting cases is exactly the case with the constant flux, which we prescribe at the top and at the bottom. And you can indeed show in this linear stability analysis that the critical wave number for this limit is 0. That means the critical wavelength of the convection cells tends to infinity. Since we have a finite box, that means there is a behavior which you would expect at the onset of convection, that there remains one big convective structure that fills the whole volume. And indeed, these studies, so this behavior is very different to the typical behavior which we know since the works of Lord Rayleigh. When you have prescribed temperatures, you have a finite critical wavelength, which is roughly two times the height. So there's a qualitative difference. And a few years later, Chapman and Proctor went back to that topic, and they basically looked at what happens if we are going a little bit above the onset point of convection. So they conducted a weakly nonlinear analysis. They derived amplitude equations, and they conducted a stability analysis of these amplitude equations. And what they figured out is that in this weakly nonlinear regime, again, for the constant flux boundary condition case, each mode is unstable to a new mode at a larger wavelength. So there is a kind of upward hierarchy. There's a kind of tendency to evolve bigger and bigger, or to develop bigger and bigger structures in such a system. So, but now you could expect, okay, when we go fully turbulent, that might stop sooner or later. So if we just choose the Rayleigh number high enough, everything decays and we observe the typical convective turbulence behavior. And what we did is, in the turbulent case, in order to see if that kind of behavior continues to exist, is we conducted a so-called Lyapunov vector analysis. And I have tried to sketch the basic idea of such an analysis on the present slide. So we can consider our turbulent convection flow as a dynamical system with a huge number of degrees of freedom, which we are putting all into this vector y. And there's a nonlinear right-hand side, which I have compactly notified by this capital F vector here. And then our Boussinesq equations, in short, can be written as such a dynamical system. And this dynamical system, or better to say, the evolution of our turbulent flow with respect to time, describes a trajectory, a curve, through an extremely high dimensional space. So I have just at the bottom estimated the number for our simulations. So the space dimension, the phase space dimension, is something like 1.5 times 10 to the 10 or even larger. Yeah. So it's a very high dimensional space. And in order to study or in order to obtain Lyapunov vectors, you are basically trying to see how strongly separate neighboring trajectories from the original trajectory. So you are shifting the initial conditions a little bit. That is indicated by this delta y vector. And then you are able to calculate an exponential growth rate of these perturbations, which is the leading Lyapunov exponent, and the corresponding eigenvector is the leading Lyapunov vector, which in our case are fields. It's a four-dimensional vector which consists of fields that depend on space and time. So what do you have to do? Well, you have to solve the linearized Boussinesq equations jointly with the fully nonlinear Boussinesq equations in the fully turbulent case. And that's exactly what we did. And other people have done this. I have given here a few references for lower Rayleigh numbers. So we went to a fully turbulent case and conducted exactly this analysis. If we would have, if we want to get more Lyapunov vectors, we would have to add more of these linear systems. And if you want to have the full spectrum, you have to add 10 to 10 of these equations, which nobody can do, as you can imagine. So the result which you get are these fields which you see at the bottom. So this is the temperature component of the leading Lyapunov vector field. And you see the structures are similar to the original temperature structures, which we see at the top. And the very bright narrow regions here are those regions which are the most unstable regions in the system. On the next slide, you see here the time sequence of this leading Lyapunov exponent, but I would like to point your interest to the very last pictures here, the two panels D and H. And there you see that when you quantify this maximum scale, or the scale at which the spectrum of the temperature perturbation has a local maximum, then you see again that this is growing in the course of time until the box size with an aspect ratio of 60 is reached. And you see that this behavior is completely different to the Dirichlet case, where basically the same quantity remains at a rather small value. So we can, in principle, confirm numerically the idea which was laid down by Proctor and Chapman, that there is a structure which develops instabilities with increasingly larger wavelengths, and this process goes on until all the structures have reached the box size in our simulations. If we would take a box that is twice as large as the one that we could use, then we would have to wait longer, but eventually we would reach again a system which consists of these two hot and cold spots. So what is it? This is in some sense a little bit unphysical. So we would like to have something that stops somewhere in between, not at the scale of the box size. So what does it mean? Well, it means we have to add a further physical process. And you might have already guessed that one reasonable addition would be to introduce rotation into our system. So we basically redo the simulations with exactly the same setting, and we add the Coriolis term, which corresponds to the rotation in our case about the vertical axis, as I have indicated it here. And also for this system, there have been already linear stability analysis conducted, for instance, here, the work of Dowling, and for a sufficiently strong rotation, which is quantified here by a Taylor number. The critical Taylor number is, I think, yeah, it's 180. For Taylor numbers which are larger than 180, the critical wave number is not anymore 0, but it is larger as 0. And that means that the characteristic wavelength becomes finite. So sufficiently strong rotation brings our system again back to the case which we know from the classical Dirichlet system. And we have done this for our simulations, again, free slip boundary conditions at the top and at the bottom, and constant flux boundary conditions. And we have varied the Rossby number, which is in contrast to the Taylor number. The larger the Rossby number, the weaker is the rotation. So, and we didn't go that far to very high, to very low Rossby numbers. That means to very strongly rotating systems, because we know that, for instance, the sun is actually a rather weakly rotating star. And, but what you can see is that this big structure is basically decomposed into substructures, which are still significantly larger as the height of the layer. Yeah. So, I mean, that these structures, the typical scales or widths of these patterns, of these convection patterns, is still much bigger, something like 5 or 6 or 7. And when you increase the rotation, that means when you decrease the Rossby number, then these patterns become smaller and smaller. And for very high rotation rates, you would expect these typical columnar structures that many people have seen in simulations and experiments. And for those structures, you certainly don't need any more an aspect ratio of 60, as you can imagine. Another route which we have taken to come closer to the astrophysical convection context is to break the up-down symmetry in our convection flow, which is always given when you are applying the Boussinesq framework. And one way to do that is by introducing a temperature-dependent thermal or temperature diffusivity. And then you go immediately to a non-Boussinesq regime, which you see here in this red curve for the mean temperature profile. This is the bottom here at z equals 0, and this is the top. And you see that for certain profiles, which I have indicated here, there's an extremely strong stratification at the surface. And for those kind of simulations, it was really advantageous to have the spectral element method, because we were able to put many spectral elements close to the top surface and could provide a very asymmetric element spacing across the convection layer. Here you see the structures, and there are two Boussinesq simulations which we have run for comparison. One that compares, that corresponds to the diffusivity at the bottom, and one that corresponds to the diffusivity at the top. And across the layer, we varied this thermal diffusivity by a factor of 500. Okay, that brings me to an end of the first part of my talk. And we have seen that a supergranular aggregation can be observed in an extended and very simple Rayleigh-Bénard convection flow when we impose constant flux boundary conditions and when we wait sufficiently long. Yeah, so you really have to wait a few thousand of convective time units to see this very slow aggregation process. A Lyapunov vector analysis demonstrates the trend to instabilities at increasingly larger scales in the turbulent regime. And I have said already, this aggregation proceeds very slowly. And rotation is one additional physical process that can stop this structure formation process at an intermediate scale, which is well below the box size. What we are currently doing is we are currently looking somewhat closer at the structure formation process from the perspective of an inverse cascade, which would take place here in a three-dimensional flow. Typically, we know that these inverse cascade processes are a two-dimensional characteristics, but here we have a fully 3D flow, And that requires a comprehensive Fourier analysis, which we are currently working on. Another direction which has just started is to go to the compressible case. That brings us certainly closer to the real astrophysical flows. And that is immediately connected with a breaking of the up-down symmetry that is characteristic for the Boussinesq case. And I have not said anything about our efforts to really push these simulations in the Boussinesq setting to very, very small Prandtl numbers, partly smaller than anything which you can observe or which you can obtain in laboratory flows. As you probably know, the smallest Prandtl number there is obtained for liquid sodium, and that's roughly 5 × 10⁻³ So that's the smallest you can get. Okay, that closes the first part. And now let me quickly move on with the second part of my talk. Everything which I have discussed in the first part was from a global perspective, mesoscale convection. So that these are convection processes which partly have to be parameterized in global circulation models. For instance, in models of the global solar convection models, but also if we are switching to our own planet in climate models or in global circulation models. And one idea or one question that we have been following over the last years is if we are able to develop data-driven reduced models that are able to describe the mesoscale convection dynamics and that are also able to reproduce statistical properties of this mesoscale convection. As you can imagine, in such global models, exactly this information, which is falling between the grid in some sense, has to be parameterized. It has to be put into some models. And this is exactly a motivation for our work. You might know very well that machine learning is an extremely far field. There is a lot, there are many methods, there are many algorithms, and there are several ways how you can distinguish these different families. And many of the algorithms have been known already for decades, but now it's all machine learning. And we have been basically following 2 routes in our research on that subject. The one is that we really tried to solve classification problems where we try to understand better the transport across extended convection layers. That is in line with the reduction of the convection patterns to a turbulent convection heat transport network. And the second part is that we are building models that can reproduce dynamics and that can reproduce low-order statistics, which brings us to the recurrent neural networks. Let me quickly say a few things to the first part. And this is a figure that illustrates how we are reducing our data. So we're basically starting from fully 3-dimensional snapshots of the simulations. That is what you can see here. Then you always have to do some kind of data reduction because there's no way to feed this information into a neural network, several million grid points or whatever. So one way, for instance, is to do a temporal averaging in combination with the spatial averaging. Then you reduce the information that is contained in such a sequence of snapshots to something like such a figure that is a time averaged temperature field. And there you recognize these kind of patterns because you have removed all the small scale fluctuations. And you see these ridges here in dark and in yellow. And these are exactly the regions locally where we have the enhanced convective heat flux across the convection layer. And if you apply now a classification algorithm, you can reduce this indeed to such a network structure in which we have trisectors and wedge points, so-called defects. And then you can study the dynamics of this network, and you can try to quantify the importance of of these structures for the overall heat transfer. The corresponding networks have a rather complicated architecture. They belong to the so-called class of U-nets. This is a U-shaped neural network that contains all the characteristic ingredients of neural networks, such as convolutional operations, max pooling operations, etc. A typical classification scheme would just end at the bottom of the U, but now we have to compose the picture again, and that is exactly what this upscaling branch is doing in such a U-net. And then you can take a look at the gradual long-term dynamics of these convection patterns. Here you see again the temperature field at the top. There's a dynamical sequence, and you see it's also quite a slow evolution in which these defects slowly disappear and new defects arise. And this can be nicely described here by these reduced information. And we are currently also trying to build a dynamical network model that basically reduces the global transport and its variability to such a simplified structure. Let me come to the dynamics. When you want to learn the dynamics by a machine learning algorithm, you have to do a little bit more. You have to implement some kind of short-term memory, some kind of feedback. And that brings us from the classical standard feed-forward neural networks to the recurrent neural networks. And there are three big groups of these recurrent neural networks. These are the so-called long short-term memory networks. The gated recurrent unit is basically the response from the other side of the Atlantic to the long short-term memory network. And the architecture I will be interested in for the rest of my talk are the so-called reservoir computing models, which have been suggested for the first time nearly 20 years ago. And those recurrent neural networks, they hopefully will be able to reproduce, to process sequential data and thus also to learn dynamics. So the idea is to build a model that prescribes the evolution of a fluid flow without solving the underlying nonlinear equations of motion, which are in our case, the Boussinesq equations. You take such a sequence of snapshots, you have to do a data reduction step, which we will do here by a POD decomposition. And then you basically train a network that learns the dynamical evolution of these POD expansion coefficients. You are then able to reconstruct the full fields and to derive properties, for instance, the convective heat flux profile from these results. We have mainly considered two cases. The one is a 2D Rayleigh-Bénard convection flow at a Prandtl number of 7, and a relatively high Rayleigh number was 10 to 7. And we have also extended this analysis to moist Rayleigh-Bénard convection, where we include phase changes into the convection process. So this is the picture of the reservoir computing model. What is a reservoir? A reservoir can be understood as a neuron network, a simplified blueprint of our human brain. it is modeled by a big random and sparse matrix, A, the reservoir matrix. And in the reservoir computing model, there are two matrices which are set and remain fixed through the whole training and prediction procedure. The one is the input matrix, which takes the data and maps them to the reservoir state. The reservoir state is A vector, and the dimension of A vector is typically much larger than the original state vector A of our dynamical system that we want to study. So the idea is basically, if you go very high dimensional, then you should be able, even in such a random network, to reproduce a complex nonlinear dynamics. And then there is an output layer. So you basically map back the reservoir state to the output layer by an output matrix. And this is the matrix which will be trained. But that can be done straightforwardly. You don't need to go through the very expensive training processes, which you typically know from feed-forward machine learning algorithms, that you are propagating the information forward and you have to propagate the errors backward, and you have to do this on and on in a number of epochs. That's not necessary in the reservoir computing model. So the training is done only with respect to the output layer. And the dynamics of the reservoir is given by this equation, which you see at the bottom. So the reservoir state is updated as a blend of a linear dynamics and as a blend of a nonlinear activation. And the blending factor is the so-called leakage rate alpha, which basically allows to change the linear and nonlinear contributions. Once everything is trained, and once all the hyperparameters of your reservoir computing model, including the spectral radius of the reservoir matrix, are optimized, the whole model runs in the prediction mode. Yeah, and so then it is basically an autonomously operating model with the optimized output matrix. Okay, and let's take a look at our applications. Well, here I show you once more what we are doing. We're taking our fields, temperature and velocity fields. We are calculating a POD expansion, and then what we are using for the reservoir computing model are these expansion coefficients, A. And we certainly truncate the model. That means we take probably a few hundred of these exponents only. And then we reproduce in the dry convection case, for instance, the probability density function of the convective heat flux, or the profiles, the vertical profiles of the convective heat flux. And please always compare the green and the blue curves, because the truncation of the original DNS data has already changed the profiles from red to green. Yeah, this is the temperature fluctuations. In the moist convection case, we have looked at something like the cloud cover or the liquid water flux. And you see that the reservoir computing models are actually performing not too bad to reproduce this dynamics. Here's another example, a recent one, where we have taken a simple model of a convective boundary layer. And there, the challenge was to look at the generalizability of these machine learning algorithms. Typically, you want to train it for some parameters, but then you would also be happy to vary the parameters and to see how the model performs then. And that's exactly what we have done here. We have this parameter beta. We have trained the model for 2 data records, and then we have looked at the prediction capability at the third parameter, where the data were completely unseen before. And you see again that these very highly asymmetric profiles of the buoyancy fluctuations or of the fluxes across the layer are reproduced pretty well. Very recently, we have also applied this to experiments which are going on in our institute, where we are measuring vorticity structures in the bulk of a turbulent convection layer by stereoparticle image velocimetry. And so the idea is here to train the networks to track these high amplitude or extreme events of the out of plane vorticity component. And even for those cases, the model perform reasonably well. So let me come to an outlook, and the outlook is something that we got into very recently. Can we implement these reservoir computing models also on a quantum computer? What you see here is the system, the first system that has been installed outside the United States, an IBM Quantum System 1, which is now in Ehningen near Stuttgart in Germany. And we had access to that machine in October and November and could do some little tests. And indeed, what we have done is we have tried to simulate the Lorenz model, which is a very, very simple model of a turbulent convection flow by a quantum reservoir computing algorithm. And the problem was a little bit further simplified by just learning 1 degree of freedom and having the other 2 degrees of freedom continually available. So this is one direction for which, in which we are currently going on. And the idea is to see how well, or is it possible really to apply these quantum computers, which require a complete change of programming paradigms for fluid mechanical problems. Okay, I'm just giving a very brief outlook, and I'm almost at the end of my talk. In the second part, I have shown you that deep convolutional neural networks are able to reduce the three-dimensional complex convection patterns, which typically evolve gradually in such a convection layer to planar networks that are time dependent and that describe the turbulent heat transfer, convective heat transfer across the layer. And I have shown you in the last part of the second part that the reservoir computing model and its application to several two-dimensional convection problems is able to predict the low-order statistics in such a system, and also the large-scale dynamical evolution in the flow. There are still many difficult problems that have to be solved in the machine learning context. One of the major challenges is really, I mean, if you want to process three-dimensional data, and at some stage you will also not be able anymore to do a proper orthogonal decomposition as we did in the 2D case. So you have to develop new encoder-decoder architectures, which basically reduce the data such that the recurrent neural network is able to process them in a so-called latent space, and then they can be again rescaled to the original resolution. One way which we follow is based on so-called matrix product states, which we try to apply for these encoder-decoder architectures. These reservoir computing models, by definition, cannot distinguish multi-scale phenomena. So if you start to modify the architecture of these reservoir computing models, they might probably even better perform for turbulent flows, which are by nature multiscale phenomena. And the last point I have mentioned already, so we are trying to follow these ideas of extending the reservoir computing to so-called quantum reservoir computing in order to describe simple dynamical systems. And with this, and with a number of publications on both parts of my talk, I thank you for your attention, and I'm ready to take questions.